Hello and welcome to Indus News live from Islamabad. I'm Jawad Tehami and these are the headlines. The Taliban have claimed 49 Afghan forces casualties during clashes in the Northeastern Badakhshan province. The group's spokesman Zabiullah Mujahid says they also shot down a helicopter and seized ammunition. Meanwhile, the Kabul administration says the Taliban's recent attacks on the country's security forces reflect their jingoistic approach. Earlier, 3 explosions by an unknown group rocked the capital Kabul, leaving 1 security personnel dead and 4 others wounded. Indian troops have martyred another Kashmiri youth in occupied Kashmir. The occupying forces targeted the civilian during a cordon and search operation in the Kariri area of the Baramulla district. The occupied valley has been under New Delhi's crushing curfew and communication blackout for the past 384 days. Belarus opposition leader Svetlana Tikhanovskaya says President Alexander Lukashenko has to go sooner or later. In an interview, Tikhanovskaya called for more protests against alleged rigging in this month's presidential election. Meanwhile, authorities have logged an array of news media websites as part of Lukashenko's efforts to curb the demonstrations. International Atomic Energy Agency Chief Rafael Grossi says he will make his first ever visit to Iran on Monday amid a months-long standoff. In a statement, Grossi said he would pressure Tehran to grant the nuclear watchdog access to 2 suspected former atomic sites. The US has recorded 1,060 coronavirus deaths overnight, raising the toll to over 175,000 with 5.6 million infections. While Brazil has reported over 1,000 deaths and more than 30,000 COVID-19 cases in the past 24 hours, bringing the infections tally to 3.5 million. India has registered 945 deaths and the highest number of daily cases with nearly 70,000 infections as the tally approaches 3 million. In Pakistan, 10 people died overnight, raising the death toll to 6,231 with over 292,000 infections. Globally, the pandemic has infected over 22.8 million people and claimed more than 797,000 lives. Those are the headlines and detailed stories right after a short break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, and now for the news in detail. The Taliban have claimed 49 Afghan forces casualties during clashes in the Northeastern Badakhshan province. The group's spokesman Zabiullah Mujahid said senior military commanders were also among those killed and wounded in the raids. He said they also shot down a helicopter and seized ammunition. Meanwhile, the Kabul administration said the Taliban's recent attacks on the country's security forces reflect their jingoistic approach. Presidential spokesman Siddiqui said the Taliban must be condemned by the international community for targeting Afghan military and people. Earlier, 3 explosions by an unknown group rocketed the capital Kabul, leaving 1 security personnel dead and 4 others wounded. Security officials said 2 blasts occurred in the police district and the third hit a police vehicle. Indian troops have martyred another Kashmiri youth in occupied Kashmir. The occupying forces targeted the civilian during a cordon and search operation in the Kariri area of the Baramulla district. The troops have sealed all the entry and exit points of the area. Police say the operation is still underway in the vicinity. Last week, 5 Indian soldiers were killed in an attack during a search operation in the same district of the valley. The occupied valley has been under New Delhi's crushing curfew and communication blackout for the past 384 days. The UN nuclear watchdog's chief Rafael Grossi says he will visit Tehran next week to pressure Iran over granting access to 2 suspected former atomic sites. The International Atomic Energy Agency and Tehran are in a standoff over the inspector's access for months. In a statement, Grossi said he hopes his meetings will lead to concrete progress in addressing the agency's questions related to safeguards in Iran. The statement said Grossi would meet high-level Iranian authorities without specifying the names. Meanwhile, Iran's ambassador to IAEA, Kazim Gharibabadi, said Grossi's visit will lead to reinforced mutual cooperation. Iran says its defense minister will visit Moscow to review issues of mutual interest with its Russian counterpart. Tehran state media said Brigadier General Amir Hatami is visiting Moscow on the invitation of Russian Defense Minister General Sergei Shoigu. The Iranian minister will also visit the 6th International Russian Military and Technological Exhibition. He will focus on ways to further expand Tehran-Moscow defense ties. Now, the majority of the UN Security Council has opposed the US to reimpose international sanctions on Iran. In separate letters, 13 countries on the 15-member council rejected the call, saying Washington's move is illegal. They questioned the legality of the move as the US unilaterally quit the 2015 Iran nuclear deal in 2018. US envoy for Iran Brian Hook said Washington does not need anyone's permission to reimpose the arms embargo on Tehran. The Security Council has 30 days to adopt a resolution to extend the sanctions relief. Otherwise, the measures will automatically come into effect. Washington is set to veto any attempt to extend any such resolution. However, 2015 treaty also directs the Security Council to consider the views of the member states. It means the body may not have to put up a draft text for voting given overwhelming opposition over it. The Sudanese Communist Party has rejected any deal to normalize relations with Israel. In a statement, the party's Central Committee said the people of Sudan stand by Palestinians. The party is a major force in Sudanese politics and one of the 2 most influential communist parties in the Arab world. This comes after a foreign ministry spokesperson claimed a normalization deal between Khartoum and Tel Aviv is imminent. He was later sacked over his remarks. Earlier, the UAE move to normalize ties with Israel sparked criticism from many Muslim states around the world. Sudan is one of the 30 countries which still don't recognize Israel. And now Israel says its tanks have targeted multiple locations on the Gaza Strip. The Defense Ministry says it struck Hamas military posts in retaliation for a rocket attack. No casualties have been reported so far. The tanks targeted positions of Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam brigades in the raids. Tensions have been rising for over a week now as Israel continues to bomb Gaza, accusing Hamas of launching incendiary balloons across the border. Israel has also closed the Karim Abu Salim goods crossing with the Gaza Strip. The 6-member Gulf Cooperation Council has welcomed a ceasefire announcement in Libya yesterday. Libya's UN-recognized government and the rival parliament in eastern Libya both appealed for a halt to hostilities. The UAE state media said GCC has called on all the parties to end hostilities and participate in the UN-mediated political dialogue to create a lasting solution in the region. Earlier, Egypt's President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi and UN support mission also hailed the ceasefire calls with the Libyan warring parties. Libya was thrust into turmoil when a NATO-backed uprising in 2011 toppled longtime ruler Muammar Gaddafi. The country has since split between rival East and West-based administrations, each backed by armed groups and the foreign governments. The UN says it believes Syria peace talks in Geneva can lead to progress, but also cautioned against hopes of a miracle. Speaking in Geneva, UN Special Envoy Geir Pedersen said this is the beginning of a long and cumbersome process. He said the talks in Geneva may lead to progress in other areas. Pedersen said he briefed the Security Council about the damage of the nearly 10-year-long war. Meanwhile, U.S. Special Envoy for Syria James Jeffrey said he will visit Switzerland and Turkey to discuss the resolution of the Syrian conflict. Syria has been entangled in a civil war since early 2011, following Bashar al-Assad's brutal crackdown on pro-democracy protests. Belarus opposition leader Svetlana Tikhanovskaya says President Alexander Lukashenko has to go sooner or later. In an interview, Tikhanovskaya called for more protests against alleged rigging in this month's presidential election. She said the release of political prisoners is one of the major demands of protesters. The opposition leader called for a fresh presidential vote in order to restore justice in the country. Meanwhile, authorities have blocked an array of media websites as part of Lukashenko's efforts to control the flow of information. Lukashenko, who has repeatedly vowed to crush the unrest, insisted the crisis would be over soon. Now, the U.S. has recorded 1,060 coronavirus deaths overnight, raising the toll to over 175,000 with 5.6 million infections. While Brazil also reported over 1,000 deaths and more than 30,000 COVID-19 cases in the past 24 hours, bringing the infection tally to 3.5 million. Now, globally, the pandemic has infected over 22.9 million people and claimed nearly 800,000 lives. More in this report.
Despite multiple countries reporting downwards trend in deaths and cases, the coronavirus pandemic is far from over around the globe. The U.S. has closed lanes at select ports of entry at the border with Mexico and will conduct more secondary checks to curb the spread of the coronavirus. In Mexico, the famous floating gardens of Xochimilco have reopened to visitors after a 5-month lockdown. Meanwhile, the World Health Organization chief says the pandemic will last less than 2 years.
We hope to finish this pandemic before less than 2 years, especially if we can pull our efforts together and with national unity, global solidarity. That's really key, with utilizing the available tools to the maximum and hoping that we can have additional tools like vaccine.
Australia's second most populous state of Victoria has reported 13 new deaths as the cases remain below 200 for the second day straight. In Europe, Germany has issued travel warnings for Brussels and French Guiana following an infection spike in the regions. Meanwhile, in Italy, citizens have headed to the beaches to cool off the heat woes, but fears remain for a resurgence of the virus. Mainland China has reported 22 new imported cases with no domestic transmissions, while in South Korea, 332 cases were reported in the past 24 hours as the country expanded stricter social distancing measures nationwide.
In Pakistan, COVID-19 active cases have dropped to a record low with just over 10,000 infected patients remaining in the country. The Health Ministry has reported a recovery rate of over 93% across the country. It said 10 people lost their lives overnight, bringing the total to 6,231. The ministry said nearly 600 people tested positive in the past 24 hours, taking the tally to over 292,000. Meanwhile, a World Health Organization-backed study says 11% of Pakistanis have developed protective immunity against coronavirus. The study suggests that areas with lower immunity rates may be at higher risk for future outbreaks. Now, India has reported a new record of its daily COVID-19 cases with 69,878 infections in the past 24 hours. This has taken the country's caseload to nearly 3 million. The Health Ministry said 945 people died overnight, bringing the death count to over 55,000. The Indian health sector is heading to the verge of collapse as active cases have reached nearly 700,000. The ministry said the state of Maharashtra is the worst affected, making up more than 38% of the country's cases. India remains the third worst hit country from the coronavirus pandemic after the US and Brazil. Now, Facebook says it has to do better to curb hate speech in India, as it battles allegations of ignoring hate speech by the leaders of governing right-wing Bharatiya Janata Party. In a statement, Facebook India's chief said the company will review and remove content that violates its community standards. Last week, a US media report said Anki Das, a top company executive in India, refused to remove hateful posts by a legislator from the ruling BJP and 3 other Hindu nationalist individuals and groups to avoid damaging the company's business interests in the country. BJP lawmaker from Telangana, T. Raja Singh, called for the mainly Muslim Rohingya refugees in India to be shot. The report said Das told staff to ignore hate speech by the BJP even after the posts were flagged by the Facebook staff. A freelance photojournalist from Indian-occupied Kashmir has bagged the Peter Mackler Award for Courageous and Ethical Journalism. Masrat Zahra was named the winner of her work covering atrocities carried out by Indian occupation forces with a special focus on women. In an interview, she said that it is her job to show the truth and take risks to do it. Zahra said she is privileged to tell the ignored stories of Kashmiri women caught up in a conflict zone. During her course of work, she was summoned by the police and accused of spreading fake news. Zahra will be honored with the award in a virtual ceremony in New York City on the 24th of September. The Peter Mackler Award honors reporters and editors from areas where independent media is under threat. More stories to follow, but right after a short break. Welcome back. Mediators from West Africa's regional bloc have arrived in Mali for talks aimed at reversing a coup that has toppled President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta. The delegation of 15-nation economic community of West African states is being led by Nigeria's former president Goodluck Jonathan. It will hold talks with the coup leaders and visit Keïta and other detained senior officials, among other meetings. A junta of military officers has controlled the country since Tuesday, when the mutineers detained Keïta at gunpoint and forced him to resign. They are promised to oversee a transition to elections within a reasonable amount of time, but the bloc has taken a particularly hard line on the coup. On Friday, thousands of coup supporters gathered in the central square in Bamako to celebrate the takeover. The UN Refugee Agency has called for renewed solutions for the displaced and stateless Rohingya communities inside and outside Myanmar. The refugee agency says the answer to the plight of Rohingya lies in Myanmar and in implementation of Advisory Commission's recommendations. It said nearly 900,000 people took refuge in Bangladesh 3 years after the crisis had peaked. The UNHCR spokesman Anze Mahicic said up to 3/4 of the Rohingya people are living outside of Myanmar. He said Rohingya people's safe return will require resuming dialogue between Myanmar authorities and the refugees. The Rohingya are described by the UN as the world's most persecuted people who faced fears of attacks since dozens were killed in communal violence in 2012. Now, South Korea and China have held the highest level of one-on-one bilateral dialogue since the COVID-19 outbreak began. Seoul's National Security Director Soo Hoon and Beijing's Communist Party's Political Bureau official Yang Jae-chi held the talks in the Korean city of Busan. The Presidential Blue House said Soo and Yang discussed Chinese President Xi Jinping's delayed visit, coronavirus pandemic, and the Korean Peninsula. She had agreed to visit South Korea last December before the pandemic struck. Seoul says it expects Beijing to play a constructive role to revive the peace process in the Korean Peninsula during the ongoing dialogue. The acutely ill Russian opposition leader Alexey Navalny has arrived in Germany for treatment. On Thursday, Navalny fell into a coma after drinking what his supporters suspect was a poisoned tea. Navalny's aides believe he was poisoned, though Russian doctors said tests showed no trace of any poison. The doctor said Navalny appeared to have a metabolic disorder and suffered a sharp drop in blood sugar levels. Navalny will be treated at the Charité Hospital in Berlin. 3 men have been killed in a shooting in northern Lebanon village. The state-run media said assailants targeted municipality policemen in Khartoum village. Police said the culprits came in a car and killed the victims with machine guns. It said the son of Khartoum mayor was also among those killed. A bomb, some weapons and electrical wires were found from the abandoned vehicle of the assailants. In the U.S., the raging California fires have killed at least 6 people, injured 43 civilians and firefighters. Governor Gavin Newsom has urged vulnerable communities to evacuate as soon as possible. Newsom said 2 of the wildfires are now the 7th and the 10th largest in the state's history. He said more than 12,000 firefighters are battling the blazes. The governor has appealed Australia and Canada for assistance to extinguish fires, while relief packages are coming in from other U.S. states as well. Emergency officials said the fires have doubled in size in the past 24 hours, burning 771,000 acres of land. In the U.S. state of Florida, eviction embargo brought in to safeguard residents during the COVID-19 pandemic will come to an end on September the 1st. This will force 800,000 tenants to leave their homes. Details in this report.
Due to the COVID-19 outbreak, the U.S. federal government introduced the CARES Act back in March. It placed a temporary ban on evictions for renters who failed to pay their bills as thousands lost their jobs and were forced to stay indoors. The aim of the act was to provide relief for tenants during the pandemic. The moratorium in Florida will cease on September 1st, leaving thousands of tenants with a tough choice to make.
First and foremost, it says that a landlord can file an eviction for non-payment of rent. However, they can't get the final action if the tenant can't pay because they're affected by COVID-19. Now, what's a final action? No one knows. That's not defined within the executive order.
Experts say even before the coronavirus outbreak, people of color have already faced difficulty in their life. The long-term inequality in the U.S. has a devastating economic impact of the pandemic, putting many in a tougher position.
Even before the pandemic, many of them were about one paycheck away from not being able to pay for shelter. And with the pandemic and the loss of income, that just pushes them over the edge. And they have to make decisions between, for example, paying the rent or paying for food.
Statistics show African Americans and Latinos are disproportionately more at risk of being evicted as soon as the CARES Act expires.
In Brazil, a historic cold front has brought snow to parts of southern cities of Curitiba and Tijucas do Sul. Locals came out in celebration at the rare sight to enjoy the light snow. The country's southernmost state of Rio Grande do Sul saw some of the coldest temperatures. Local media said the region registered -8 degrees Celsius. Brazil's Met Body has issued an alert warning in the state of Mato Grosso do Sul because of the cold snap. It has also urged residents to stay warm and covered up. Now, several states across Australia's southeast have been surprised by a late snowfall due to Antarctic air sweeping through the region. Many people came out to enjoy the surprise event despite wild winds and heavy snow closing down the roads. The winter whiteout swept across New South Wales, Victoria, the Australian Capital Territory and Tasmania. Australia's Bureau of Meteorology said the cold weather will likely remain for several days. Locals and people from other towns and cities travel to enjoy winter one last time, with spring less than 10 days away.
It's brilliant, especially for the kids and other people that can't get to the snow, or those that don't quite have the funds or the finance for the snow. This is absolutely brilliant for them.
Pakistan's President Arif Alvi has felicitated Turkey over a major discovery of natural gas in the Black Sea. In a congratulatory tweet, President Arif Alvi said friends revel and rejoice in the happiness of fellow allies. Palestine and Azerbaijan also applauded Turkey for the achievement. On Friday, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan announced that Turkey has discovered 320 billion cubic meters of natural gas. He said more reserves are expected to be found in nearby areas of the Black Sea region. Now, Pakistan says leading smartphone manufacturer Samsung is considering setting up an assembly plant in the country. In a tweet, Industries Minister Hamad Azhar says smartphone production in Pakistan is multiplying after the recent launch of the mobile policy. The minister met with Samsung Pakistan Managing Director and CEO in Islamabad to discuss the future roadmap. The Samsung officials lauded the government's policies to facilitate mobile phone industry in the country. Currently, around 14 smartphone companies are producing handsets in the country. It's time for a short break. We'll be back with more stories. Stay tuned. In football, Sevilla win Europa League for a record sixth time after beating Inter Milan 3-2 in a thrilling final in Cologne. The triumph marks the fourth Europa crown in the past 6 years for the club. Inter striker Romelu Lukaku's early penalty levelled Brazilian Ronaldo's record of 34 goals in a season for Inter. The drama started when Romelu Lukaku deflected Sevilla defender Diego Costa's bicycle kick into his own net. Luke de Jong responded with a couple of headers to turn the tie on its head before Diego Godin restored parity in a frantic first half. Jules Koundé made a goal line clearance in dying minutes as the Spaniards survived an Italian siege to secure a first major trophy for the coach Julian Lopetegui. In the National Basketball Association, the Los Angeles Clippers, Toronto Raptors, Utah Jazz and the Boston Celtics have won their first-round playoff games at the NBA's biosecure bubble in the Disney World. Clippers beat Mavericks by 130 points to 122 in the Game 3 of their Western Conference first-round playoff series. LA's Kawhi Leonard scored 36 points, while Dallas's Luka Doncic posted a triple-double of 13 points, 10 rebounds and 10 assists from the bench. Meanwhile, Raptors downed the Brooklyn Nets 117-92 to open up a 3-0 lead for the first time in team history, whereas Utah thumped the Denver Nuggets by 124-87 points to take 2-1 lead, with Mike Conley hitting 27 points. Earlier, Boston defeated the Philadelphia 76ers by 102 points to 94 to grab a 3-0 advantage, with the Kemba Walker recording a team-high 24 points. And now the weather situation from around the globe. And that is all for now. For the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at Indus.News.